Our next speaker is Dr. Karen Farst, who will be presenting drug-endangered children in our communities. Dr. Farst is a child abuse pediatrician at Arkansas Children's Hospital and an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Arkansas Medical Sciences. She's the director of the university's Center for Children at Risk. Dr. Farst is a past president of the National Children's Alliance Board of Directors. She earned her bachelor's degree and her medical degree at Texas Tech University and completed a Med-Peds residency at the University of Arkansas. She then did a child abuse fellowship at Cincinnati Children's Hospital and then completed a Master's of Public Health at the Fay Bozeman College of Public Health at University of Arkansas. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Farst.
Well, good morning, and I will echo my colleagues' appreciation to the AAP for allowing me to speak and for your attendance at the plenary. In my faculty disclosure, I do not have any conflicts of interest to disclose. I do have a handout posted for the session, and there are references included with the handout with some of the issues that we'll talk about. And this term drug-endangered child, it may be familiar to some of you, it may be a new term. I chose a definition from the National Alliance for Drug-Endangered Children just to put us all on the same page for the issues that we'll be talking about. So we're talking about children, this could be infants and children, who would be at risk of suffering physical or emotional harm as a result of illegal drug use, possession, manufacturing, cultivation, or distribution. And so we'll talk not only about some of the direct impact that exposure can have, but also some of the long-term impacts as well. When we think of how children may be impacted, I was in primary care for several years before I went into fellowship training and specialty training. And this is really wherever you practice within pediatrics, you will come in contact with this. So obviously those of you who are providing care in the nursery or in the NICU, you will see that as far as moms who have used drugs during pregnancy. But even if you're not in that kind of frontline setting, you will definitely have kids that you encounter that either have acute issues, such as an ingestion or an injury, or that you may notice have behavioral problems or other stressors just because they're living in a home where drugs are being used or manufactured. So we're going to move through a few of these spheres, and I'm just going to disclaim up front that we're not really going to talk about adolescent substance abuse in and of itself. I don't want to disregard that as an issue, but just for the time of the plenary, we're going to talk more about drug use during pregnancy and then just what it means for a young child to be living in a home where drugs are being used or manufactured. So this is obviously not a new problem. If you look back to this is a medical ad from the turn of the century, and so you can see the claim for this is that heroin was introduced as a pharmaceutical in 1898 as a cough syrup, and it was marketed as a non-addictive morphine alternative. So probably not quite the case, but just to give you an idea that this is obviously not something new as far as substance abuse issues. The press really picked up on when kind of cocaine usage was at its nexus in the 1970s and 1980s. It really became a hot topic within the press, and they did pick up on, many of you are probably familiar with the word crack babies, and so that became a hot topic in the press as well. And there was really this very doom and gloom, if you look back at some of these articles and stories, that really kind of painted the picture that if a child was born to a mom who had used cocaine in pregnancy, that they were just doomed to be intellectually disabled, physically disabled, things like that. Thankfully, there was some really nice cohort studies that followed that followed kids into school age and beyond and showed that while there were some measurable effects, really, if the quality of the environment that the child was raised in was good, that really was not this sentence of doom and gloom. It was something that we needed to be aware of, but not something that we needed to necessarily write that child off as being permanently damaged. And then my time in this, I was in primary care in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then I started in child abuse pediatrics in about 2004, 2005. And that was the time that in my part of the country, in Arkansas, that methamphetamine had become this huge public health issue. Mostly because people had figured out you could make methamphetamine in your home with kind of precursor things that you could get over the counter instead of having to run the risk of buying it from street dealers. And so now not only did you have parents that were using methamphetamine in the home, but you also had clandestine methamphetamine labs where there were caustic chemicals, there were explosions, things that added their own extra public health danger for a child in the home. So when I started practice with child abuse pediatrics in 0405, I had child welfare workers coming to me saying, what do we do with these kids when we go to a home and they've been taken out of that type of a situation? Do we drug test them? How do we decontaminate them? What does it mean for them? And so this was really kind of my entry. This was not anything I really learned about in medical school or even in fellowship. And so this was kind of a learn on the job. I became actually really good friends with our local DEA in narcotics. I have some really kind of odd friends as a pediatrician, but they really helped me learn a lot to be able to kind of understand a bit more about what this meant from the standpoint of the child. This was on a billboard on several interstates in our state during the time that methamphetamine, it was really kind of a public health campaign to help people realize just how damaging methamphetamine was. And so this is really kind of showing serial pictures of the same person when they had come in for multiple arrest records and just showing their physical decline over time as a result of their methamphetamine addiction. From my lens as a child abuse pediatrician, I always, I look at that and I think, well, I gosh, wonder how many kids she has in her care and how many kids are in her home, because this is really some of the struggle. Yes, there's this direct concern we have about what kids might be exposed to, but then we also are struggling with the fact that a parent with a significant substance abuse disorder can struggle with being an appropriate parent as well. And now, of course, we're in the time where, from a press standpoint, you really can't go through a day without hearing another story about the opioid kind of epidemic or the rise of this. This is not a new problem either. When you think of the opioid issue, I think one of the things that's really brought this to the head is that there's kind of three different types of this issue stacked on top of each other now. So misuse of just semi-synthetic opioids like hydrocodone and oxycodone has been an increasing problem for years. The CDC has recognized that. There's been some efforts to try to kind of advocate for responsible prescribing. But then if you stack on that heroin has now become more available just from drug distribution trends, and it's a less expensive alternative, we have an increasing number of people addicted to heroin. And now, just kind of recently in the past few years, the synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, have become more popular as far as abuse as well. So now there's all three of these kind of accumulating on top of each other. And so, depending on where you are in the country, they have kind of tried to track in order to help with education parts to see what part of the country maybe has the most problem with people overprescribing opioids. In this map, you really don't want to be in a purple shade or a dark purple shade. My state, Arkansas, is unfortunately very dark purple. And so because of that, because we do have, I think, kind of an overabundance of prescriptions being written within our state, there is quite a bit of effort to try to help people prescribe opioids within a responsible manner. So again, from a child abuse pediatrician standpoint, this is a problem from a public health standpoint, but the other part of this is that there is an increasing number of parents with a substance abuse disorder. I know that our nurseries are seeing an increase in neonatal abstinence syndrome, and we are seeing an increase in kids come in with ingestions of just picking up a tablet and having something happen from an ingestion standpoint at home. So again, if we kind of go back to our overlapping spheres with this, I'm just going to move pretty quickly through some of the different realms of where this might impact and start with substance abuse and pregnancy. I don't work primarily in the nursery any longer. I don't work in the NICU, but I do get asked quite a bit about, how can we quantify if there is a direct impact on kids when moms have used illicit drugs in pregnancy versus just kind of more of the risk about having a substance abuse disorder. And this is really hard research to do. Moms that have a substance abuse disorder oftentimes have other kind of co-occurring risks that are with this as well. So they may also use nicotine, may also use alcohol. Alcohol is by far and away the most teratogenic of substances that somebody could use. They oftentimes just have overall poor health as well, don't necessarily participate in prenatal care on a regular basis. So it's really difficult to tease all that out and attribute a specific risk to a specific drug. But there have been, I think, some well-done longitudinal studies that are trying to kind of control for some of these confounding factors. And there there is a measurable, it's subtle in a lot of cases, but there are some measurable effects, mostly dealing with kind of neurodevelopmental architecture, placental insufficiency. This is especially true for the stimulant drugs such as cocaine or methamphetamine, because one of the ways they exert their impact is by vasoconstriction, and that obviously, if it interrupts the vasculature connection with the placenta and the uterus, then you can have a placental abruption. Preterm delivery and growth problems. But you look at that list, and I think you can all recognize that you don't have to use drugs in pregnancy to have a placental abruption or a preterm delivery as well. So one of the cautions that I kind of have both in the medical realm and with the child welfare realm is to make sure that we don't necessarily jump to the conclusion that substance abuse has necessarily physically harmed the child. Let's look at it more as showing us that this is a family in need of intervention and services to try to use an opportunity to get services and hopefully break the addiction, make sure that the child has a safe and healthy and nurturing home to be able to grow up in. Kind of the same issue comes if we try to look at what the measurable long-term effects are. Again, a lot of kind of co-occurring and confounding factors go into this, but some of the studies have shown that there really are some issues that can kind of carry over, and kids can have an increased need for rehospitalization in the first year of life. They are more likely to be kind of scored and characterized as having inattentive behaviors. Some folks will have a speech delay, growth delay. So there are some things that will play out. But the good news for me, especially when I talk to child welfare and talk to foster care groups, is that in all of these studies, really the most significant factor is the quality of the home environment. I know from a pediatrician standpoint that doesn't sound like rocket science to you, but that is a good news message to deliver, that this is serious. I'm not saying at all that there's no effect of using illicit drugs in pregnancy, but I think it is important for us to kind of provide that counterbalance, that instead of trying to turn this into being mad at a mom for using illegal substances, let's look at it as a time to really try to use that opportunity to get somebody into services while at the same time making sure that the child has a safe and nurturing environment to live in. So if we move kind of out of the nursery and then just into the home, so children in general, if they're in a home where drugs are being used, and especially if it's a home where drugs are either being manufactured or it's a place where drugs are being distributed. So there may be large batches of drugs there that are being kind of cut, put into baggies, different things for distribution. So young children are unfortunately a perfect storm for being harmed in that type of a situation. They're home more, they're not out at school playing with their friends, and so they are around for more exposure. As you know, they have hand-to-mouth behaviors. They don't regulate well to say, oh, I shouldn't pick up something that looks like candy or looks like juice and put it in my mouth. And they also rely on their caregiver very much to be able to protect them from those things. And that's one of the obviously unfortunate parts of a substance abuse disorder, is that being kind of alert as far as your parenting skills is oftentimes impaired with that as well. So we've seen several kids that have come in with ingestions, with caustic ingestions, with burns, with different types of injuries, just from the environment of having exposure there. There is also, especially if you think about some of the stimulants like cocaine or methamphetamine, there is a risk for things like physical abuse or sexual abuse just because of the impact of the drug on the caregiver and other adults that are in the home. But substance abuse obviously doesn't occur in a vacuum. We're not talking about just substance abuse. So oftentimes a substance abuse disorder is just one of many co-occurring risk factors with that caregiver or that parent as well. So the co-occurrence of domestic violence, many people that use substances are doing so to self-medicate for a mental health disorder that either hasn't been diagnosed yet or is undertreated. And if you have depression, methamphetamine can make you feel great. If you have anxiety, marijuana will definitely kind of help take that edge off. So we see these as co-occurring, and so again, if we focus just on kind of being mad at a mom for using substances or whether or not the child has been physically harmed, I think we somewhat miss the boat on kind of the bigger public health part of this and our role to try to encourage services to get to the family. And sometimes that does include child welfare intervention to hold a caregiver accountable for being involved in services and making sure that the child is safe while services try to play out. I think hopefully most people in the room are familiar with the term adverse childhood experiences by now. And if you have heard me kind of talk about some of these co-occurring factors, you may have even realized that a lot of those things I just listed are actually independent adverse childhood experiences in and of themselves. So we think about, from a child abuse pediatrician standpoint, being physically abused or sexually abused certainly is, but living with a parent with a substance abuse disorder, living with a parent that has a mental health disorder, witnessing domestic violence in the home. So again, when we think about all of the different cumulative risks for this and then some of the long-term adverse outcomes on this, it really is a huge public health issue and such a big opportunity for us as pediatricians to be involved in trying to really advocate for a better response within our communities. So what should our response be? What is the role of the pediatrician in this? And I would really encourage you to know what's going on either in your nursery, in your hospital. Know what's going on, especially as far as what is happening from a drug testing standpoint. If you are drug testing newborns or drug testing older kids, advocate for there to be an objective set of indicators that is driving drug testing. Be part of the voice that tries to get some of the bias out of just drug testing folks that either don't present well or maybe are low socioeconomic status. So really do advocate for that. If you are doing drug testing as well, please advocate with your labs to be able to take the next step and do confirmatory testing so that we aren't guilty as healthcare providers of providing potentially false positive drug test results that could get out into the child welfare system and cause decisions to be made off of potentially inaccurate information. And then what I've talked about as well. So I work as a child abuse pediatrician full-time now. I know very well the struggles that are there as regards to communicating with child welfare and being confused sometimes at seeing the disparity in their response. But don't give up on that. So reach out, find out who is kind of a supervisor in your area, who are the policymakers, and really try to join with them and find out what type of information they need in order to make their decisions about safety and services for children. Because I think a lot of times they need some of the language from us from a medical standpoint that's kind of buried in the medical record. And it's up to us to try to pull that out and put statements of risk in there that then they can act on to kind of get their services to go forward. If you're facing a situation where your state is trying to criminalize drug use in pregnancy, I would encourage you to get with your local chapter of AAP too and advocate against that. So pregnancy is the best time to intervene and get services to break that cycle. If we criminalize, there is really no good data that there is good substance abuse treatment for parents that are then incarcerated around this. So this is really our great public health time to do this from a service-oriented standpoint, not from a criminalization standpoint. And then we talked a little bit about ACEs. I know from speaking to several of you here at the conference, you are screening for ACEs, and that's great. I hope to hear in more things that are published and in maybe the next NCE in New Orleans about what people are finding are the targeted things that really hit that population and make some evidence-based outcomes, because I think this is hopefully a place where we get to intervene and have some really positive effect. I would be remiss if I didn't bring up marijuana. I'm sure if I asked you guys how many of you have heard, it's only marijuana. Many of you would raise your hands. I won't ask how many of you have said it's only marijuana. But I think, again, it's one of those topics that it's important for us to know the truth. So the marijuana of today is much stronger than the marijuana of the 70s and the 80s. And so a lot of the studies that we have about what marijuana does during pregnancy and to the brain really are kind of hard to interpret because they weren't done on kind of the potency of marijuana today. We do know that just short-term recreational, similar to just social drinking, that probably doesn't impact the ability to parent well. But if you are regularly using marijuana, especially if it's to self-medicate for an undiagnosed mental health issue or just because you have an addiction issue, that definitely impairs your ability to be a nurturing, watchful, supervising parent. We know as well that for adolescents that are using, that does impair learning ability as well. So in areas where we have a big representation here, some of you are probably in states where marijuana has been legalized, and those areas are seeing upticks in kids coming in with ingestions and ending up in the PICU and different places like that, just because it is more available. There's been a great resource that just came out from the AAP about marijuana use during pregnancy. I know many of you may deal with the fact that OBs and family medicine folks tell moms it's fine to use marijuana in pregnancy because it does help with nausea. And that's where I think, again, our voice has to be the balance to say that's probably not the best thing when we think about the health and development of the child that is in their care. Another just great resource that just came out, it was interesting as I prepared for this, there was a couple of recent things out from the AAP about the fact that medical marijuana, now that it comes out, may kind of start to create some conundrum about kids that would get into issues where medical neglect might be proposed if parents are choosing medical marijuana versus standardized care. So I think this is also to be continued as far as more issues in the future. So just as we kind of wrap up, I know I talk as a child abuse pediatrician, a lot of times I give pretty negative talks. And so you guys are a captive audience because they stuck me in this plenary, and so you had to listen to child abuse stuff. But I think there is really some hope. So everybody kind of knows the negative part of adverse childhood experiences, but I think one of the things, and I have been so encouraged by conversations here, about looking at the positive things we can bring into families to kind of overcome this. And we know that, yes, adverse childhood experiences create risk, but let's think about things like the HOPE project of identifying those families at risk and bringing in positive parenting and supporting and things like that to really try to build the family up and try to break that cycle. I know it's a big topic, and I appreciate all of you being able to be here to listen. And again, there are references in the handout that talk through these issues. And I'm happy to talk to you as well kind of after the plenary as far as just your personal issues. So thank you very much.